Welcome to episode 16 of the Expert Cruise Show. I'm Anthony, he's Chris, and we're about to take you to sea on board Chris's favourite ocean liner of all time. And isn't it wonderful to actually have travelled on your favourite ocean liner? I mean, it's not like it was just in a history book. Like, you actually have travelled on it. And the thing that kind of brought Chris and I together is our mutual love for this ship, which I first travelled on in 1975 when I was 6 months old. And the second time I went on it was in 1984.
Yeah.
And so it's a long time since I've been on it. The ship now is a floating hotel. Have you been on it since it was a floating hotel?
No,
I think you're a bit scared to do that, aren't you? We'll talk about that a little bit later.
Let's get to that, yeah.
So the ship we are talking about, of course, is the QE2, otherwise known as Queen Elizabeth II, or as Her Majesty the Queen mistakenly named it. She said, I named this ship Queen Elizabeth II.
Yes.
She was talking about herself, wasn't she? But actually, the ship was the QE2 because the former ship was the Queen Elizabeth, which was sadly, capsized, as we discussed in a previous episode. So just tell us about your connection with this ship and your first experience. I've done mine. Come on, this is like it's like an AA meeting, this, isn't it? It's like, hello, I'm Anthony, and I'm
anonymous.
Obsessed with ocean liners.
Oh, that's so good. Actually, you could run a group like that on board, current Cunard ships, because so many people's story starts with this particular one with QE2.
Yeah.
For me, reading about ocean liners as a child, obsessed by the Titanic, and then looking more and more into the other ships that were operating on the transatlantic service, I stumbled across, obviously, as most people do, the Cunard line, because it was major competitor to White Star Line, but also, Carpathia had saved the Titanic survivors, and just looked into this fleet and realized that they still had an operational running ocean liner in service, the only ones that were still doing the transatlantic at the time in the 1990s, and of course that was QE2. And I started to collect the brochures and learned the deck plans, became just mesmerized by this beautiful ocean liner that was still doing that remarkable service. Eventually, my dad actually booked us a cruise on a small Cunard ship called the Cunard Crown Monarch. It was operating in Australia at the time, but they pulled it from its service. It wasn't working for Cunard in the market. It wasn't doing what they wanted it to do. And they put the credit towards a future booking on the QE2. And this was remarkable. I remember my dad coming home from work, actually, and telling us that we're going on the QE2. My mum thought it was a joke because, of course, in the 90s, the QE2 was the luxury liner, and, who could afford that? But my first time seeing the ship was in Auckland Harbour, 1995, 30 years ago. Woke up the morning before the cruise, crack of dawn, and looked out the windows of the hotel, and there she was, docking in the harbour. And it was just this electrifying, exciting moment of seeing this ship and realising this is all true. We're actually going to go on a real ocean liner. So
it's so wonderful. I wish I was able to put into words what it is about a ship that just connects with some people and leaves others completely cold. It's so funny because some people just don't get it. And QE2, obviously, she was a British ship, a Scottish ship built on the Clyde in 1967. I think they started on her. She launched 1969. Is that right? If I can.
She launched 67. Yeah, they started work on her 65. Yeah,
65. Okay, so she had that. What was different about her? I think the clear differential is that the previous ships were much more Victorian in style, or Edwardian in style, or kind of had that kind of old school flavor. QE2 was plastics, and it was really that kind of Conran 60s style that Brits kind of loved, and it was a huge risk for Cunard. People at the time were a little bit like, "Oh, what is this?" But did people take to it straight away, or was there a lot of traditionalists who were like, "Oh no, this is not for me"?
Well, from the moment that the artist's renditions of what the interior was going to look like were released, there was a lot of people who were like, oh, no, this isn't for me. And behind the scenes, of course, because Cunard had been operating like Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth since the 1930s and 40s, they built up a reputation of having those traditional style liners with the Art Deco interiors, which itself was... we discussed this in the Queen Mary episode a few episodes back, which is definitely worth tuning into if you want the backstory here. But that design and that style in the 30s was very different for Cunard. Again, in the 60s, when they were looking at building the ship that ultimately became QE2, they realized that the image of an ocean liner was associated with everything to do with the past. And they were in a period of time in the 60s where jet aircraft were becoming more and more popular. It was the space race. Americans were going to land a man on the moon by the end of the decade. Star Trek was on TV screens. People just wanted the future. And so ultimately when they built QE2, they put an interior in her that reflected the very best of the 60s style. And what's really interesting, the ship was, as I say, the keel was laid down in 65. She was launched down the slipway in 67 and then entered into her maiden voyage in 69. And we have this image in our heads of QE2, when you say plastics and that sort of thing, of being kind of like a budget experience, but it wasn't. It was like spared no expense. Interior was just beautifully decorated in a 60s style, but done very, very well. And what they found was the big risk was, would the Americans take to it? And that was going to be the make or break, because 50% of the transatlantic traffic is people coming to Europe from America, right? So QE2, designed as a dual-purpose ship, floating resort and transatlantic liner. She would go cruising, but she also needed that transatlantic service to work. And when she arrived in America, the press toured her, and then the public just fell in love with her. And what you found was that people who wouldn't have traveled on the Queens, Mary and Elizabeth, started to travel on QE2 as young people. So QE2 attracted like all these people in their 20s and 30s who then stayed with the ship for 40 years.
I was actually talking to my mum about this. She was like, because we were talking about how the world is going to hell right now in a handcart. And she really was saying, she was born in 1949, but she was saying that really her generation was the best generation in terms of what they had access to. They hadn't been like corrupted by social media, although she is now. But she got that best period of like growing up right after the war and seeing the Europe get itself back together. And so I guess 20 years after the war, this beautiful ship shows up just in time for people to have started to get back on their feet, and for the nation certainly to kind of feel like they deserved a ship like that, because there was all that whole attitude of make do and mend and nothing extravagant. I mean, the UK was still on rations for that period, even after the war. And so I think that certainly the conversations I had with my grandparents and stuff, they couldn't shake that kind of wartime mentality. And I think, QE2 was like ready for that flower power generation in a way. I mean, it was the kind of Austin Powers of the cruise ships, wasn't it?
It was. I mean, I think what's also really interesting is that today, I think if you had a ship that sort of stood out so much as being different from what's possible on everyday life, you might get like a feeling of resentment towards it.
Yes.
But something to do with the QE2 in that period of time, there was immense pride amongst the British public of the fact that they were able to build something that was so much beloved around the world, but also so spectacular. I mean, just look at the lines of the ship. She's just so perfectly balanced. When she first entered service, particularly like just the cleanliness of the lines. She looks fast, she looks sleek, she looks modern, but she's an ocean liner. She's got this like remarkable heritage that she continues, but she's doing it in her own way. And I think people really went with that in Britain. And then I think access to a actual legitimate, true British style for the Americans was huge, because it wasn't the Disneyland of cruise ships. It was an actual British cruise ship in British 60s style that was operating the transatlantic service. So I think that's kind of why it took off so well at the start. And interestingly enough, Anthony, like Cunard had to sell mortgage rather 12 of its ships and take out a government loan just to build QE2. Massive gamble.
Right.
Everyone said they were nuts, but they were able to start repaying their government loan within the first year of service because QE2 did take off from the start.
The thing I kind of love about it was, and we've said this before in previous episodes, is that she was really a bit of a hodgepodge of rooms and cabins, and it was like they squeezed a cabin in wherever they could find a bit of space, and so you weren't all facing the right direction. And now, certainly with Queen Mary 2, which replaced QE2, the cabins are pretty much identical, unless you're in Queen's Grill. But otherwise, the cabins, obviously, they're built off-site, and then they're modular, and they slot in, and they're all pretty similar dimensions, and the finish is the same. I mean, my memory of being on QE2 was being in an inside cabin. We might have had a little porthole. I can't really remember. We certainly didn't have a window or a balcony. We might have had an opening porthole, like being on Queen Mary. And in bunk beds, and it being very uncomfortable. And I shared a room with my grandfather, which was an experience I would not recommend to anybody. And my parents, I guess, shared a room with my brother, and it really was like camping to a certain extent. There was no luxury associated with it. We were very much in steerage. And my first trip, that was obviously the one I'm referencing, is when I was 9 years of age. So I have memory of it, and I have lots of pictures of it. And so I'm able to kind of recall it, put it all together. And then when I did 1975, I was 6 months old, and we went to Tenerife and Madeira from Southampton. So that was like a little, obviously I don't have any memory of that.
Basically.
Right. So there's that cruising in one season, and then there's that crossing in another. And QE2 was really the first ship that was purpose-built to be a cruise ship and an ocean liner, whereas previous ships, they either were converted to be cruise ships. I mean, in fact, they made quite a few changes to QE2 to kind of really support that cruising experience, didn't they?
Well, the original design for a replacement for the Queens, it was given a code name of Q3. They were originally planning to build a full-on traditional ocean liner, and it was going to have a deeper draft, and it was going to be longer. It wasn't going to be able to fit through the Panama Canal. And of course, when they went to, seek funding for this, they were basically laughed out the building. Like no one was building, with business sense in mind, traditional ocean liners in the 1960s. So they went back to the drawing board, and they actually looked at several existing designs of ships that were successful dual-purpose liners. So there's like the Rotterdam, for example, from Holland America Line. She was dual purpose. She was built to do two roles. The Home Line's Oceanic was dual purpose. And even Cunard had some experience with this because they built an ocean liner, Coronia, but they put some cruising elements into her in the 1940s and 50s. And actually, she spent most of her career cruising. They painted her green to make her stand out. She's quite an interesting ship. We could do an entire episode just on the quirkiness of Coronia, where passengers would bring their furniture from home to decorate their cabins because they were on board for so long. It's just a totally different world. And so with this, they then went back to the drawing board and developed Q4, which became QE2. And it was a smaller ship that was designed to do the two roles. So rather than 3 classes, she was ultimately launched with 2. There was first class and tourist class, but no gates. Everything was just sort of designed so that you would end up in the right spots, which meant that when she was cruising, they could actually make it open to everyone. You could go to all the bars and lounges, as opposed to on the Atlantic, where they kind of kept the class structure operational early in her career. And because of this, the ship then was able to have that flexibility to do these two roles. And that's really, really important because, like, even in the 60s and 70s, no one was going to spend the kind of money that was required to do a winter crossing on the QE2 regularly. So she had to go somewhere. And because she went south to the southern summer to come down to our part of the world, she became popular and beloved everywhere. So QE2 was known. Like, she came to Australia 25 times. There was people standing on the pier with tears in their eyes as she left for the last time, because she was a symbol of, like, shipping and British ambassador around the world, but also just such a beautiful ship that visited so many different ports. But we kind of remember QE2, as you said, was a bit of a hodgepodge, and that was towards the end of her career because she'd had so many refurbishments. But back when she first entered service, the whole interior was uniform. So she had so many different iterations that your memories of QE2 would differ depending on when you were last on board.
We did discuss this the other day, didn't we? We kind of talked a little bit about how your experience of QE2 could be completely different to somebody else's experience of QE2, like depending on when you travelled on her and depending at what stage of her life she was at. Do you know, I was thinking about what you're saying about Australians and the British Commonwealth, the former British Empire, as it was around the world, because Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II was the reigning monarch for so long, and she named the ship in her name. I guess it kind of was different to other ships that weren't named by the reigning monarch. And so in a way it was like the Queen was visiting Australia. Even if she wasn't on board, there was the Queen in Buckhouse, as we say in London, but there's also this Queen that is sailing around the world in her name. And that obviously is wonderful for international relations. And, it's like the soft power of the United Kingdom and the British Commonwealth.
Also, the Queen and the royal family had a very sort of unique connection to QE2. So not only did Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II christen the ship, and as you said, she actually didn't open the envelope that contained the name Queen Elizabeth in it. She personally altered the title to Queen Elizabeth II. Cunard and Buckingham Palace then agreed to use the Arabic II, so it was Queen Elizabeth II for the ship. But she visited the ship a number of times, and she sailed with the ship as the first ever reigning monarch to stay on a operational ship whilst it's underway with passengers in 1990. And Prince Philip visited the ship a number of times. Her Majesty the Queen Mother went on board QE2 in honour of the anniversary of the original RMS Queen Elizabeth. Princess Diana sailed on board QE2 with a group of underprivileged school children in the 1980s. Various other members of the royal family visited the ship. Prince Charles, King Charles now, of course, was the first ever person in the visitors book because he was on the bridge wing when they went down the Clyde for the first time. When the ship was preparing to get ready for sea trials. So there's a deep, deep connection with the royal family and the QE2. I mean, Her Majesty the Queen, she boarded the ship in its farewell year to have a photograph taken with all of the surviving captains. I mean, what other ship would she do that for?
Right.
So the QE2 was special to her, and I think that's why, because of the continuous visits and connections with the active royal family, QE2's sort of story stayed so relevant. It wasn't just she launched it 40 years ago, but she's like literally visiting it now.
I really do feel that they struggled as a family to kind of live on land. And so whenever they were at sea, certainly on the Royal Yacht Britannia, that was their real kind of home from home. That's where they wanted to be. The paparazzi couldn't get to them. They could walk around the ship in their pajamas. They knew the crew like they were family. And this is very well documented. And Britannia was a beautiful ship. Ironically, the same name as what Cunard describes as their first ship in the Cunard
purpose-built
line.
ship.
That's right.
Yep.
Is there any connection between the Royal Yacht Britannia naming and Britannia of Cunard, or is that just coincidence?
No, I think because Britannia being like
rule
the
Britannia.
nation, exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
They love to be at sea, and so if they're on Britannia or they're on QE2, makes no difference.
Yeah.
It gets them offshore, which is a very comfortable place for the royal family.
And also the Royal Yacht Britannia with the royal family on board rendezvoused with QE2 on a number of occasions. I mean, QE2 famously went to the South Atlantic as part of the Falklands campaign and carried 3,000 troops from the 5th Infantry Brigade and the Scots and Welsh Guards and the Gurkhas down to Ascension Island, actually just near the Falklands. And then she returned with survivors of the HMS Ardent, Antelope and Coventry, 3 ships that had been lost by the Royal Navy during that conflict. And when she arrived in Southampton waters, the Royal Yacht Britannia with Her Majesty the Queen Mother on board rendezvoused with QE2 to welcome them back. And then Her Majesty the Queen Elizabeth II, she sailed aboard Royal Yacht Britannia to rendezvous with QE2 in 1990. And of course, you see all these iconic photographs of the two ships together, both built at the same shipyard.
I was going to say, they're both John Brown ships, aren't they? Built on
yes.
Clydebank, yeah.
So both beautiful ships with beautiful lines, but, of course, both now retired and preserved, thank goodness. So you can still see them.
And the royal family were very happy to kind of keep coming back to Cunard and naming the ships. And so Queen Mary II was named by Her Majesty the Queen.
Yes.
But then she returned again for Queen Elizabeth, and I was thrilled to be invited by Cunard to attend the naming ceremony of the new Queen Elizabeth. And that was like one of the best days of my life.
Oh, it must be so cool.
Yeah, I was like in the second row, and I was right in front of the stage, and there was the Queen, and there was the ship, and there was the guards and the band, and it was I'll put some pictures up, but it was a really, really special day to see another ship with the name Elizabeth in the Cunard fleet, because, of course, by that time, Queen QE2 had kind of made her final journey to Dubai. We'll talk about that towards the end of this episode. I want to kind of talk about the good days, really, because she's not experiencing her best times right now. But I get a sense that when you meet people on cruises these days, especially people of that baby boomer generation, a lot of them have a relationship with QE2. It was possibly their first cruising or crossing experience. And so it's kind of what got them addicted into modern cruising. Would you say that was like a bridge to what we experience today?
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's difficult for people, particularly younger people, to quite grasp why QE2 is such a special ship to people, because I think generally we forget that in the 70s and 80s, save for the formation of these sort of fledgling cruise lines, which ultimately became these massive companies like Carnival and Royal Caribbean and NCL, a lot of shipping lines were on the decline at that period of time. Atlantic liners were declining. By the 1970s, QE2 was the only one left doing that. The SS France, for example, which was operating as an Atlantic liner, she was laid up and ultimately put back into service as the SS Norway. QE2 was at ultimately she ended up at just over 70,000 gross tons, but she was considered one of the largest ships in the world. She was one of the largest ocean liners ever built, even though she's dimensionally quite a lot smaller than the previous ships. There hadn't been that many ships of that scale built up to that time. So she had a sort of a unique place in the market and in people's hearts, because she was doing this service that no one else was doing, and she was kind of going against the grain, still doing that. And I think because that also then did that global, world cruise route, there were only a handful of ships that were doing world cruises.
Right.
I mean, Canberra for P&O was doing it. She was very famous as well. But QE2, a ship like that coming to Auckland and to Sydney and having refurbishments, mid world cruise in Hong Kong and visiting Cape Town and Durban, and what other ship was doing that?
That's my memory as a kid, was the fact that the QE2 was like the only ship that really was a ship of state and had that level of luxury and was, the ship that everybody talked about. And I mean, I'm sure you and I are similar, but even when I was like 7 or 8 years of age, I had pictures of QE2 on the wall. I mean, these days, my kids now, they have pictures of Labubu's on their wall. I mean, goodness knows what that is. But I had written out the stats with stencil. I'd actually written it out myself. 963 feet long, 69,000 gross tons, 105 foot breadth. I
used to draw them.
You did?
I used to, I mean, this is like nerd alert, right? But I used to like imagine what she would look like in the future, because in my mind, she was going to stay in service for my lifetime, because like, how dare you retire the QE2, you know?
Yes.
So I had a version of it with extra balconies on, and then I had a version of it with tenders in the bow, like Norway ended up having because ultimately she'd have to go do more cruising. No one could have guessed in the 90s that there was going to be quite the level of cruise boom that there has been around the world, and certainly no one in the 90s thought, no one except Stephen Payne in the 90s thought that a ship like Queen Mary 2 would be built. So QE2 for most of her career from the 70s onwards was literally billed as the last of the great ocean liners.
Right. It is remarkable. I mean, my book collection keeps growing every time I go to secondhand shops and bookstores, and I find more QE2 books, and I love kind of re-educating myself about it, because there was a period for 20 good years when I was a young adult that I'd kind of forgotten about the ship, and I regret that because I never traveled on her really as an adult. And when I did the crossing with Queen Victoria, the maiden crossing with Queen Victoria, and QE2 was the tandem, and I got to watch her cross the North Atlantic, and that was a great privilege to actually just be a mile or so away from the ship and to watch it.
I mean, these pictures you talk about are just amazing.
Yeah, and video too, just to see it kind of diving and this kind of amazing...
Oh, awesome. You got to send it to me. I can't believe I haven't seen it.
Yeah, but it was
cool.
Such a gift. I mean, that's the other thing, isn't it? Because when you're on a ship, you experience the interior and some of the decks, and you kind of get to know the ship. But I've always loved that moment when you get off a ship on a tender, and you're kind of going away from the ship, and you actually get to see the superstructure and the hull and the bow and see how this thing is floating. And because they're so steady, so many of these ships now, that you really forget that you're on a boat at all. And so you kind of... You lose sight of the fact that you're at sea. But so to be on a tender and to look back at the ship, and I've done this with so many ships now, and I just love that moment. But with QE2, to be able to see her crossing the Atlantic as we did was just dreamy, really, because that was what she was built for. And with that, I love the fact that people who loved QE2, who possibly might not have been able to connect with Queen Mary 2 as the successor, now that we're 20 years into Queen Mary 2's tenure, they really have fallen in love with that ship in the same way that they fell in love with QE2. And so Queen Mary 2 is... I mean, it kind of doesn't really matter that QE2 is now in Dubai in a slightly unusual state, because Queen Mary 2 has very much proved herself as the successor, not just as an experience to sail on, but as a feeling, that feeling of that ship of state. And you can talk to fans of these Cunard queens for hours about this stuff, and they'll never tire of the joy that it brings them.
Yeah, it's so true. I think Queen Mary 2, it was a different introduction to service to how QE2, how it's been described aboard QE2, because whereas QE2 pretty much attracted a large proportion of first-time Cunarders, a younger cohort from the very start, Queen Mary 2 really relied on people coming across from Cunard, as well as bringing in a smaller number of new sailors at the start. And they spent a lot of time talking to Cunard travellers, because Cunard had a big fleet, right? So there wasn't just QE2 people coming across to Queen Mary 2, but there were people who would have sailed on Sagafjord and Vistafjord and Royal Viking Sun and Sea Goddess 1 and Sea Goddess 2. So there was all different styles of Cunard, Scandinavian, Norwegian, super yachts. There was some 4-star cruise ships as well. They were trying to get all these people to experience the ship for the first time. And because you still had QE2 in service, that crew, that QE2 crew who had honed that craft for decades, stayed with QE2 for the most part. There were some people that moved across, but most of them stayed with QE2. And I think because of this, a lot of people who were very familiar with QE2's crew and the way they did things on QE2 went to Queen Mary 2 and looked at this remarkable ship that has, undoubtedly better accommodation, more amenities on board, was more modern, had greater head height for you to clear, deck heads and that sort of thing. You don't have to duck as many times. And they came back and said, oh, it's not the QE2, because it's the crew that really makes the ship. And that's the thing that Queen Mary 2 has now, is that the crew's been with her long enough to have that electrifying feeling when you board the ship, that it actually has this soul. And when I boarded QE2 for the first time, she'd been in service since the 60s, and I was in the 90s, right? So she already had that. So I only ever knew her to have that. And every other ship that was younger didn't seem to have that. And I was like, well, why are all the other ships not as good?
That's such a
Queen
great
Mary 2's
observation.
got that now.
Yeah. Because this is the minutiae that they would never print in the brochure, right? They would never say, oh, we got a brand new crew and they're a little bit new at this, and you might, because we remember reading all of those blogs about Queen Anne's first kind of couple of months, and when I did the Queen Anne maiden transatlantic, that was 6 months later, and so by then they'd pretty much ironed everything out, and I was very pleased for that, because I knew people like Carol and Paul were having a terrible time on the first kind of maiden voyage, and the crew is everything, isn't it? You know, that's what my grandmother used to say. She would travel on all these ships, including Vistula and Sarja and QE2, and she'd say, oh, I went in, because she was a proper Cockney, I went in the bar and he remembered my name, and I was in this restaurant and they knew who I was, and she kind of talked about it as if it was a home from home. So wonderful.
Can I tell you one of the strangest true stories, right? Yeah. QE2's last year of service, 2008. So in March of 2008, Rochelle and I sailed on board QE2. It was her first time on board the ship, and I just wanted to... I actually booked it before the retirement was announced. So it was a week before, actually, having a terrible day at my day job, and I went for a walk and decided I'm going to book a cruise on the QE2.
Just to make you feel a bit better. Yeah,
just to make me feel better. And then a week later, they announced the ship was being retired. So of course we went, and we stayed on board. We were on from Sydney to Singapore. So we ended up doing all the Farewell Australia voyage. Absolutely remarkable voyage. And most mornings we would go to the Lido for breakfast, and we tended to go through. There was a port and starboard serving area. We tended to go through the one on the port side, and there was a guy, a chef that was there, who was making the eggs cooked to order. So you could have over easy or scrambled, or you could get them to do an omelette or whatever. And so Rochelle every morning would order an omelette in a particular way, and I would order 2 eggs over easy, so flipped over. And okay, so that's breakfast, whatever. Like, that's the cruise. And we left QE2 in Singapore, and months later, after our book had been published, I was invited to be a guest speaker on board in her 8th or 7th last cruise that she ever did. And we flew to the UK. We boarded the ship in Southampton, and first day out in the bay, crossing the Bay of Biscay, we go down to the Lido. We go through the portside serving station. We get to the egg station, and the same chef is there. And without even asking, he says, omelette the way she liked it, and the eggs over easy. He remembered us, and we were on board in March.
Yeah.
Now, we were younger people. I'm quite tall, probably a little bit recognizable. But the fact is, he must have seen thousands of people in those months, and yet he remembered.
That is
And I'm not the
incredible.
only one that happened to. Yeah, it's crazy.
And so it's so interesting, isn't it? Because, some people, I guess they like a cruise for one reason or another, but there's something about Cunard and its history and its heritage and the responsibility of the crew on board to kind of maintain that through line, that kind of narrative that is now 185 years old, to actually be part of the journey and to give you that experience that is so memorable. And what I love about this whole storyline is that I could never have afforded to have gone on on Concorde. There was only 100 seats on Concorde, right? So it was that was really for the elite. But QE2 was accessible. And I think that is something that's important to note, is that, we are able to travel on these ships because they made themselves accessible, and you could get steerage and shitty cabins and just to get on the ship. And that's the advice I give people now. I'm like, don't worry so much about your accommodation, just get on the ship, whatever the ship, you can worry about it when you're on board. And I feel like QE2 really offered just the experience of getting to know the ship and being with the ship and learning about how she felt and sounded, and the just the creaks and all the subtleties of being on a ship with personality. Could you talk about the refurbishments just quickly, because I'm very interested in what was changed. I know about the bringing in balconies and creating that kind of those upper decks, but just talk about what changed aside from the engineering, because I know she was re-engined, but from a passenger's perspective. In your opinion, did they really make some good decisions there? Because she was unrecognizable as a ship to how she was when she first launched.
Yeah, they made a lot of changes to her. I think, actually, funnily enough, that the period of time that she was put into service means that without making most of those changes, they probably wouldn't have been able to run her for as long as they did. So, she was designed in the 60s, in the sort of early... McKeel was being laid in 65, right? So she was already designed by that stage. And things had changed quite dramatically in those years. So when Trafalgar House Company purchased Cunard in the 70s, one of the first things that they did with the company was to put some of the balconies on QE2. So they put an initial block on board, and that was really like the highest quality of accommodation. So with that came a new restaurant, the Queen's Grill restaurant. They reorganized some of the other restaurants on board, and then progressively they made a number of changes to the ship. Ultimately, they built more balconies onto the top decks of QE2, and then they did interior refits, but they were kind of piecemeal. So there was bits of the ship changed. The tourist class dining room was renamed a number of times and refurbished. Some of the sort of passenger areas were changed and tweaked. But in 1986-87, when she was having her big re-engineering work done, that's when the most dramatic external change took place, because she had the new funnel built, which is actually built with pieces of the old funnel, but it's much, much fatter, gave her kind of a very different external profile. But they also introduced some sort of Art Deco inspired spaces on board. They reorganized the double down room into the Grand Lounge. And so by the early 90s, there was kind of 4 or 5 different styles on QE2. Passenger corridors that were wood-lined and looked sort of like the old ocean liners. And then there's Art Deco rooms, and there's 60s rooms, and there's, the chrome still used in some of the spaces on board. So it really came down to that big refit in 94, where they decided this ship has an engine and a power plant and a hull that can last probably 2020 could have lasted without major works. We have to make the interior match the passenger expectation. And so that massive refurbishment, which is just before I boarded the ship for the first time, that sought to sort of unify the ship under one cohesive design. And it lent into some of the elements of the original interior, but it introduced a lot more woods and sort of more tones, and brought in some more earthy tones to the ship. And she actually looked spectacular with that original 94 project lifestyle, they called it, interior. But then over the years from 94 through to retirement, and particularly after Carnival acquired the ship, they made tweaks here and there. They changed things here and there. So she probably looks a little bit more like patched together again towards the end of her career than she did in 94, where she really looked, when I bought it in 95, like just so good. But again, the cabins were still small. After the 94 refit, she had better bathrooms in the lower cabins, though, because they redid all the bathrooms on board. They brought in like little marble sinks and wood finishes and stuff. So she was an interesting ship. She had a lot of personality, and I think that kind of added to the allure of life on board.
I do regret not sailing on her. I know I said it before, but just the fact that my memory is so faded of her, and actually there's not. I mean, I watch all these documentaries, these old BBC kind of travel documentaries about life on board and people doing the world cruise, and it's very interesting. But even back then they weren't very good at photographing the interiors. It was, and also early videotape was, or even film that they used. Everything looked so dark. You didn't really get to see any of the kind of the light kind of coming through the ship. And so I actually do want to go to Dubai. I've never been, and I want to go see the Burj Khalifa with my own human eyes. Maybe you and I should meet in Dubai. I mean, maybe that's a closer place and go on board QE2 together. But I recognize that now, maybe we could just finish with where she's at now. So she was bought by this Dubai, what were they, was it like a property company or who bought her?
It was the investment arm of Dubai World.
Oh, that's right, yes.
So she was under Nikhil, was the original brand that they were using. Yeah. The intention, Anthony, was to actually give her some scale of refurbishment. There's multiple different versions of what that might look like, and birth her at the Palm Jumeirah. And actually, at the Palm Jumeirah, if you look at the Google Maps or the satellite images, you can see on the trunk of the palm that there's if you're looking down on it, it's on the right-hand side, there's like a T-shaped thing that juts out, and that was going to be where she was going to be birthed.
Right.
But, QE2 retired in 2008, and you remember in 2008 there was a global financial crisis.
Yes, there was.
Basically, when she arrived in Dubai, she was birthed at Port Rashid, which is their... where the cruise ships used to dock there.
Yeah.
She was left there... Passengers left, Cunard crew disembarked. She was handed over to the new owners. There was a captain, chief engineer. The ship was still operational, and she sat there as an operational ship with a V-ship's crew on board until 2012. And in fact, could have still done sea trials and been reclassed. She could potentially. They looked at maybe taking her to Cape Town for the FIFA World Cup.
That's right. They were going to put the footballers on board, weren't they? They were going to have them stay on board, and they talked about that for various Olympics and things using her, but nothing really came of it. I mean, it kind of became quite a sad story, as I remember.
Yeah, it was pretty tragic for a while. In 2012, I think it was, the crew was paid off and the ship was shut down, and they moved to the dry docks and kind of used as my mate Luke, who viewers would have seen on board Queen Mary with me, he went to Dubai and he actually saw it tied up against a tanker. He sent me pictures, and I said, I can't see for the tears, It's just so tragic to see it. But, fortunately in 2018, actually, it was 2017, they announced that she was going to open as a hotel. 2018, I think that's when they did. And they've progressively been refurbishing her. And look, I mean, I'm going to withhold judgment until I see her in person, because the photographs show some areas that are very recognizable and some areas that I wouldn't recognize at all. But at least that beautiful form, that amazing ship, isn't scrapped. I mean, she still looks on the outside. If they put the lifeboats or replica lifeboats on, I'd be a much happier person, because she looks a bit strange without her boats. Yes. But she just still looks so ready to go. She looks she could just set sail, because she's so speedy looking, and her bow is
like
so
a racehorse, isn't she? Yeah,
she is. Yeah, she doesn't want to sit there docked. But look, no one else was going to offer $100 million to buy QE2. It's their ship now. So the changes, just like with anything that's been sold as a commercial venture, as much as I don't want to see her changed, the changes are theirs to make. Hopefully they're able to respect the history. And I never wanted to go back to her as a hotel. When I left her for the last time in 2008, I looked at the gangway door and I put my hand on the hull and I said goodbye. And I thought that was going to be it, because I didn't think that she would be the same after she retired. Yeah. But now, all these years later, I've got this sort of, and after having been on Queen Mary, I think maybe I might have to go back. But I'd love to know from our listeners and our viewers, if you've been, or even if you haven't, should I meet Anthony on board QE2? Should we do that?
It would be definitely fun to do. I actually have a friend who's just moved to Dubai, and he's like, you must come. And I was thinking, Burj Khalifa, QE2, maybe not such a bad idea. But I recognize that the clientele for QE2 now, they're used to a much higher standard of accommodation. You only have to look at these hotels in these new cities, places like Dubai, where the standard is higher than pretty much anywhere else in the world. And so to get on a ship from 1969 and to experience, tiny little windows and bathrooms that are, you can't swing a cat in, no wonder they had to refurbish it. And so, they've kept some original, but some now they've kind of built a box within the old rooms and created a kind of very modern experience. And I get it, but I just don't get it. Because if you want to go on the QE2 to experience the QE2, surely you'd want to be on the authentic and original design. It's just so unfortunate that it's incompatible with that market. So if it had gone somewhere else, if they'd have sent it to Scotland, for example, then people would be like, I'll just take it as it is and have no problem with it. But because it's in Dubai, it needs to have these upgrades made.
The bigger thing for me is maintain the exterior. So like QE2 looked like QE2 with her boats. I understand they might have to take the old davits and stuff off, but fiberglass replicas are a possibility. Rotterdam has her boat still on board, for example, and she just looks amazing. But also the public spaces, like the activation of those spaces is what's really important. So the Lido is very popular with people in Dubai, interestingly enough, because they do a fantastic buffet there, and apparently buffet lunches are a big thing there. So there's quite a lot of locals who go on board QE2 just for the buffet lunch, which I think is kind of fun. And she has the Golden Lion pub, which they advertise as the oldest pub in Dubai. Now, it's from 1994 as well, but of course Dubai doesn't have pubs. So QE2 has one, which makes it stand out a little bit. I wouldn't know how it feels until I go back, and maybe you and I should do that. But let's see what people say. We'll do what people
maybe
want.
We need to wait a few years. I'm open to it, but like I say, I don't have the memories like you do. So I would be making new memories, and I suppose that's really the best place to start. Okay, we have to dock this ship, unfortunately, for another week. But
we talk about QE2 forever, but I guess we can't.
Well, I know. I mean, it's funny, isn't it? Because we had this with Queen Mary in Long Beach. Your first experience of being on board was just such a kind of dynamite experience for both of us. For me to kind of see you enjoying it and seeing it for the first time, and I think it would probably be a similar thing for me going on QE2 again with my limited memories. So I would love to see that.
If you end up going, I'm going to have to go. I couldn't do what you did and be like on FaceTime and be okay with that. Like, I'd have to be there.
It's pretty equidistant, isn't it? Dubai is a waypoint for you.
We just need everyone to share this episode to make enough an ad revenue so we can both meet in Dubai.
This is true. Okay, well, do that. Share the Expert Cruise Show as much as you can. If you love it and you want to put it on your Facebook or whatever, and if you know other people that would get some pleasure from these kind of informal conversations for cruise nuts and ship fans, then you know where to come. And we'll come back next week and bring you another episode of the Expert Cruise Show. But for now, take care.